In this lesson, we're going to focus on the concept of shading contour forms and drawings. The lesson objectives are to use a variety of pencil shading methods and blending techniques to apply shading and value on different types of forms. We're using shading and blending to remove outlines on contour forms and drawings, and to demonstrate the ability to create a smooth gradation of shading on basic forms while matching the areas of value at the same time. In most situations, we begin with a drawing, and our drawing begins as contour lines, right? We can see outlines of the forms, whether they are geometric forms or organic forms. Then we apply shading to make these objects appear more 3D and to show the textures and the different areas of value on the forms. So, good shading and blending removes the outlines from our drawings. We're no longer relying on outlines to show the edges of the form versus the background. This is a really good example. So the artist literally applied pencil shading right at the edge of the form so it stands out from the background. And they blended using their blending stump and smudgy to make the object appear three-dimensional. This example also doesn't rely on outlines to show the edges of the forms on the paper. But of course, if we really examine this example, we can see lines on the seashell, we can see lines on the leaf. But the purpose of those lines is to help show the texture, and that seashell actually had printed lines on the surface. These faint lines help show the ridges of the leaf. So what's missing in the shaded compositions of shoes? Outlines. These examples here, do they rely on outlines to show the edges of the forms? So the edges are created using areas of value. We shade right to the edge of the form, and then we blend it using a variety of techniques and tools. So you saw this example earlier, so you can see now more of a close-up. So yes, there is value right at the edge, because how do we know where is the background versus the form? But due to the shading right at the edge, it makes the objects appear 3D. Also creates contrast because these forms appear to pop out at us. So the edges on these forms are created using areas of value. We really want to avoid doing this. Yes, you start with an outline. You have contour lines to show the edges of the form versus the background, the edges between other objects. But then when we apply shading, we're trying to get rid of those outlines because we're trying to make them look three-dimensional. Same thing here. These are good attempts of value and shading, but they're still relying on outlines to show the edges of the forms. Even no matter what you're shading with, whether you're shading with white charcoal on black paper or regular graphite pencil on white paper, we really don't want to rely on outlines anymore. We can see the edges due to the areas of value. This is a great example here. This is a three-dimensional form. It's geometric, but is this relying on outlines? Not so much. You can see lots of cross-hatching here, and you can see the edges because it starts from one value and then it gradates into another value. But this technique requires practice. This is my contour drawing of an origami paper crane, and here it is where I shaded it with pencil. So we're going to practice shading areas of value to remove outlines. Make sure you follow along in this video where I demo portions of the shading exercise. Practice activity, be aware that there's 2 pages. This is page 1, this is page 2. So for this practice activity, you're going to need your pencils, your blending stump, sandpaper to clean off your blending stump, a kneaded eraser, your hand blot so we don't smudge your work, and your value scale. We're actually going to use the numbers on the value scale to help us out when we are figuring out the layers of value. So the instructions are, you're going to practice shading the simple shapes. Refer to the reference photo for the levels of gray. Each shape is demonstrated in this video. These shapes are small, so use a blending stump, not a smudgy. This is just too small for a smudgy. This exercise is assessed for the cleanliness of your paper too. We should not see outlines. So when you're done with these 2, you should have something kind of like this. So to create this outline, we need to draw a line from the dot to each corner. Then we're going to shade the triangles to match the values in this image. So the shading needs to match what is printed here. So to start this out, we're just going to lightly draw a straight line that's going to go to each corner. If you realize your lines are too dark, you can take a kneaded eraser to lighten your lines. Next, before we actually start adding value, let's go to our value scale. So you're going to actually match the values that are printed here. So based on our value scale, I would say this area here is going to be a value of a 7. So that means when you're shading, we want to get to a value of a 7. And then this area is kind of a value of a 4. And then this value here is going to be a value of a 2. So we do not have any pure whites, and we also don't need to worry about the value. Same thing here. We're going to take our value scale and match up the values. This just makes it so much easier, so when we're shading, we actually have something to reference because we've already created it before. So for this section here, I would say it's a value of a 7. This section here is going to be a value of a 5, again, according to our value scale. This section here is going to be a 4, and we're also going to make this a 2. So I'm going to actually shade using my 2B pencil because I know I can get a lot darker. So again, when you're shading this area, you want to make sure you're not going super dark right at the edge, but we want to apply enough graphite so when we go back in with our blending stump, it will be easier to actually blend the values. When you're ready, you're going to take your blending stump and actually apply value. I've blended a little bit, but I realized this is still not dark enough. This is still kind of a value of like a 5, so I do know I need to go darker. When you're ready, again, you're going to go in with your blending stump to actually smudge these values. When you feel like you've pretty much matched that value of 7, you can also check using your value scale by actually checking, did I make that value of 7? But now I'm going to move on to the value of 4. Again, I'm going to shade using my 2B pencil. I'm going to keep it fairly light. I'm going to go in with my blending stump to blend this area of value. Now you do have to get your blending right to the edge, right where the edge of this outline is. But we also do not want this 4 to blend into the 7. Now, if you get a little crazy and you blend outside the lines, you can actually use your kneaded eraser to clean up all of those smudges. Now, the value looks a little dark, so I'm going to actually take my kneaded eraser and just do big blots to lighten up my value. The last section here is the value of a 2, which is very, very light. So again, we're going to go really light with our pencil. You really don't need to use a lot of pressure. Make sure your blending stump is as clean as it can be, because once you start blending, those values will get dark. Again, you should end up with something kind of like this, where we can see each shape. Now you're going to do the same thing for the square. We are shading four triangles, and we've already labeled the values. So when you finished with this section, you should have something shaded kind of like that. The instructions here show you how to actually create this diagram inside the box. So first, we're going to draw an X from corner to corner. Then we're going to draw the box. If you think your lines are too dark, you can take a kneaded eraser to lighten your lines. Now, before we end up shading, let's figure out the values of this based on our value scale. So this area here, these two areas are the same value, so we're going to use a value of 7. These two areas here are the same value, so we're going to use a value of 5. These two areas here are a value of 4. And this here, which is the lightest, is going to be a value of 2. So remember, when you start shading, we don't want to rely on outlines. We're just using the edges of the outline to know where the edge of the shading is. So I'm going to actually start with the value of 7. So I'm going to go pretty dark, not too dark, but I want to build up my layers of graphite. So I finished this area of 7, so I have a choice. I could go ahead and complete the other area of the value of 7, or I could actually go to a different value. I could work on the 5 and the 2 and the 4. So you decide what order to complete these values in. So as I've been working on this example, again, you might want to hold it up to double check that you are matching the values. I've been actually rotating the paper, and I'm using my hand blot to make sure that I'm not going to end up smudging any of my shading. And here we are. Here's the finished example. So here's page 2. It's pretty much the same exercise, except now you have more areas to shade. It's a larger space, but the areas of value are going to be pretty much the same. We are going to create this shape in here. How to draw the lines within the box. Now be aware, this is the criteria I'm going to be using to evaluate both pages for this practice activity. Now the areas of value are not the same as the other page. They're slightly different. So for the darkest value, we're going to use the value of an 8, again, according to our value scale. For the lightest area, we're going to use a value of a 2. For the second lightest area, we're going to use a value of a 4, and for the second darkest area, we're going to use a value of a 6. So these are the values we're going to focus on according to our value scale. This shading is very similar to what you did here, but pay attention to where the dark and light areas are. You decide where to start. You could start with the darkest values. You could do one box at a time, but again, as you're shading, you want to look back and forth and compare your values and use your value scale to help you out. And here's the finished example for the page 2 of this part of your practice.